sir.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming, and let the record show that we have a full house, even though some might have wandered over on the other side temporarily. So I'd like to call the meeting to order. And I have one little procedural matter I'd like to deal with before we call the witness. And this is, I'd like the committee to consider something. Yesterday morning, there were several accusations hurled at the Office of the Auditor General as to inaccuracies in the report. In order to clarify that, I would request that the committee ask the Auditor General to fact-check those accusations and report with documentation back to the committee, if that's okay with the committee. Yeah. Okay. So can I then ask the Office of the Auditor General to look at the discrepancy in facts that were enunciated yesterday and report back to the office with supporting documentation, including the people who were interviewed and the number of persons and the time.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to come back with our evidence base, and I'll bring it to you before the hearing next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then actually, and for the general public, we're continuing to deal today with the Office of the Auditor General's performance report on the efficiency and effectiveness of the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, commonly known as OFREG. And our first witness this morning is Mr. Duke Monroe, the Executive Director of Fuels, Regulation and Competitive Office. So I invite the Deputy Sergeant to bring in Mr. Monroe.
I swear by Almighty God that, I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this Honorable Legislative Assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning, Mr. Monroe. And on behalf of the committee, let me take the opportunity to thank you for making yourself available as a witness to give evidence to this committee on the Office of the Auditor General's report on efficiency and effectiveness of the Utility Regulation and Competitive Office. The rules are that when you ask the first question at the beginning, please state your full name and the position that you are representing to the committee so that that appears officially in the Hansard. So I guess I will start off the questionings and then turn to the other committees. Mr. Monroe, would you agree that the public has been unhappy for a long time with the level of retail prices that they face at the fuel stations? And with the advent of off-reg, that unhappiness is now directed towards off-reg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Duke Monroe, Chief Fuels Inspector and Director of Fuels Off-Reg. In relation to the question, Mr. Chair, in terms of public sentiment, we have gotten very clear feedback in terms of how the public feels about fuel prices. The latter part of your question, I'll summarize as I recall, is that are you asking whether it's laid at the feet of off-reg in terms of where prices are? So in terms of the expectations around fuel prices, it may appear that the expectation as it relates to prices is for fuel prices to be made cheaper and not optimized. We need to be very clear in setting expectations for the public, particularly as it relates to the law. The Fuel Market Regulation Law, Section 2, speaks to what our requirements are at this point in time, is to ensure that products are procured and supplied to the island in a reliable manner, in a fashion that accords with the global prices, global refined prices, and not global oil prices, and that the benchmark that we're using needs to be clarified. It's something that we recognize, and we have been making efforts toward making that clear to the public, that the benchmark cannot be, for instance, the US, because the dynamics and the settings of that market is very different from the Caribbean and the Cayman Islands. So our reference point, I think if we bring more clarity to the reference point for prices, we may have to change that sort of language and the understanding and expectations persons have. Because if we take a survey right now as to what the public expect from prices, you will recognize it's simply unrealistic. It's impossible in terms of some of the numbers persons would talk about in terms of where prices locally should be.
Would you agree that the whole purpose and the main selling point for the bureaucracy and the massive legislation that was presented to this legislature to create off-reg was to give people lower prices and better internet access? Because that's recorded in the Hansards of the House.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I can't speak to the details as to what was presented, but I am aware that off-reg was created to ensure fairer prices to the public. And in ensuring fairer prices, we are also, as I mentioned, to reiterate, it would include the quality and the reliability of the price that is the product that is offered to the public. So I do appreciate and understand, but I believe we have a responsibility at off-reg to the public to have them better understand what fairer prices mean, because if we're looking at jurisdictions where prices are significantly lower, there are a number of other factors that are responsible for that. Some of these they have refineries on island. They don't have to supply fuel from overseas, and taxation and other such regime that influence where prices are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have here a copy of the Utility Regulation and Competition Law 2016. And it also says Law 49 of 2016. And I just want to read for the record Section 6(1) of the law. And it says, the principal functions of the office in the markets and sectors for which it has responsibility are: A, to promote objectives set out in any policy; B, to promote appropriate, effective, and fair competition; C, to protect the short and long-term interests of consumers in relation to utility service, and in so doing, 1, supervise, monitor, and regulate any sectoral provider in accordance with this law, the regulations, and sectoral legislation, and any general policies made by Cabinet in writing; 2, ensure that utility services are satisfactory and efficient, and that charges imposed in respect of utility services are reasonable and reflect efficient costs of providing the services; and 3, publish information, reports, and other documents relating to utility services, and D, to promote innovation and facilitate economic and national development. Section 6.2 goes on, which I won't read at this time. It lists out basically the powers that the office has in that regard. The reason why I am raising that, and there's a gentleman, I think it's Mr. Scott from Cayman Brack, who normally calls in regularly on the show. And around several weeks ago, he had called in, and he sometimes lists out the different ships that are coming, where they're coming from, and where they're going. And in one particular morning, he actually spoke about one of the fuel ships that was stopping in Cayman and where else it was going on. The reason I'm raising that, Mr. Chairman, is, and going back again to the Fuel IQ section that is on the Rubis website, the Rubis Cayman Islands website, it lists on a daily basis, if you click on it, the different prices for different jurisdictions at a particular time. And the question I'm asking then, if a ship is traveling from one jurisdiction to the next, carrying the same commodity, is it then for us to say that that ship will stop in one jurisdiction, sell fuel at one price, continue on to another jurisdiction, and sell fuel at a different price? Is that what it is that we are expecting, or that what is it that the public must understand? Is that the same ship dropping off the same fuel is charging Cayman companies a different price than they're charging other companies right next door? Because they're not letting this come to Cayman alone, they're stopping multiple places. So is that what we're to understand? That's what I'm just trying to understand. So that's my question to you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness. Is that the process?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, sir, for the question. In terms of ships and the pricing offered to various jurisdictions, no, that is not the case. Any ship that supplies fuel here will be pricing the local jurisdiction based on the price that they've acquired and any other logistics or reasonable cost that they would incur to get the fuel to this jurisdiction. We do not track what the shipping and logistics company do in terms of prices offered to various jurisdictions, but what we have and what we verify is that once that ship brings fuel to the Cayman Islands jurisdiction, we can verify the date that product was sourced, because those source documents, they're called bill of lading and other invoices, those are provided to us so we can see the date at which that product was procured from the Gulf or international terminals, and we also get the price at which the product is invoiced to the Cayman Islands.
But it is my understanding that some of those very invoices are actually from other subsidiaries of the same companies that are actually buying them.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, sir, that is correct. Currently, the arrangement is that they have a subsidiary that purchase fuel for their group of jurisdiction that they supply fuel to. So to elaborate further, the Rubis and the Salts, they don't buy for Cayman Islands only because the quantity will not justify them berthing at a refinery or a terminal to pick up parcel sizes of maybe say 100,000, 150,000 barrels. So they purchase much larger parcels, they call them, and then they do what they refer to as milk runs that you referred to earlier to supply that fuel to the various jurisdictions within their portfolio. Thank you.
So going back to their portfolio, then in essence, the only difference that's supposed to be in prices, since they're all buying it in bulk, buying the parcels in several, is just the additional transportation cost of getting into Cayman versus going someplace else. Because if they're coming out of the Gulf, and I think we can all agree to some extent that Cayman is a closer jurisdiction to the Gulf than, say, Bahamas, then at a minimum, I would expect then that the cost to get fuel in Cayman would be cheaper than it is to get fuel in, say, Bahamas, because they have to travel a longer distance. Can we agree on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the cost for freight is dependent on the jurisdiction and its distance from the source point.
Yeah.
So that is correct.
Good. So then I'll ask the question then, since these same companies that operate in Cayman also operate in Bahamas, why then is the fuel cheaper in the Bahamas than it is in Cayman?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The prices in Bahamas is actually controlled. So Bahamas is a price-regulated market where government sets the margins for both wholesalers and retailers.
Okay, so I'm glad. So there is then, since and yesterday now, going back to the testimony of the first witness, the Dr. Honorable Linford Pearson, and they were saying that we had copied the model from the Bahamas when we were setting up the Office of Utility Regulation here in Cayman. Then the question is, why didn't we also go a bit further and look at the model that Bahamas have in terms of having those level of price control? So then I'm going back again now to the law, where the law speaks to your office in particular, providing advice to Cabinet and providing advice to Cabinet in terms of what is actually beneficial to the consumer. So then my question in all of this is, what advice in the 3+ years since offering has been in existence, what advice has OFREC provided to Cabinet or to the government of the day with regards to regulating fuel so we can at least start getting better prices to the consumer?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Thank you, sir, for the question. So the response will be multifaceted. I need to condition the earlier response in terms of the reference you made to Bahamas, because currently Bahamas prices are lower than Cayman. We cannot say, and we have evidence to show, we can produce, that those swings, it fluctuates. So while it's lower right now, there are instances where it's much higher. So the mechanism in itself does not provide a solid reference for us to use just this instance to say price regulation, because there are times when it can actually hurt or harm consumers. At the highest level of our work in the regulation office, we understand that we are not to rush to the nuclear option as it's considered of price control. When we speak of competition, the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, that comes with a number of qualifiers in that you and I can speak of competition at the farmer's market. In layman's terms, me and the two guys that are competing to sell, let's say, mangoes, but in the sector, it comes with certain requirements. If you are to do a search of the Utility Regulation and Competition Law, you will see the word market appearing more than, I would guess, maybe 50 times. That means regulation has to be defined and applied in a very scientific, in a very methodical manner. What we are doing right now in the office is to define those markets. We have previously outlined that one of the challenges we had faced was the funding to actually get that work done. That work is underway. As we informed at the last sitting, I believe, that work was progressed. Unfortunately, it was impacted by the COVID. But we are far advanced in the process to complete the definition of the markets, because it's in the definition of the market that we then decide what intervention, what regulatory mechanism needs to be instituted to regulate that segment of the market. So to go a bit further, in the Cayman Islands, we assume that we just have retail market, which is the fuel that is sold at the dispensers. But it goes beyond that, because we're recognizing that not all gas stations can supply fuel to all of the public. So we then have to define relevant markets and decide where we will need to intervene. To go even further, the diesel consumers may not have significant negative sentiments about diesel prices, we may not need to intervene. So to just take a very high-level approach of regulating prices is going to defeat the purpose that we're seeking to accomplish, and it may not also be applicable. And of course, it's going to be a waste of resource to regulate something that need not be regulated. Thank you.
I think somewhere in the off-reg law, it calls, I think, either on the board for either an economist, or I think there's somewhere along the line within the office that you have your own economist employed, or the expertise of an economist in off-reg. And I suspect that that requirement is there, as you mentioned, to deal with the markets. Well, markets run on two fundamental principles: supply and demand. And where they meet, I think that's referred to as the equilibrium sorry, excuse me. With that said, supply and demand. The consumers are the demanders, and Sol Rubis and whoever are the suppliers. For a market, there are also certain principles for a market to be effective. And there's got to be like a free points and different movements and where it moves in there. The reason we regulate these areas is because there are a very small amount of players in the market. That's the reason why regulation is required. We don't regulate supermarkets because, other than a public health standpoint, to make sure people are getting quality, because there is competition on supermarkets. We regulate CUC because they're the sole provider. And wherever there is a monopoly, a duopoly, a cartel, or an oligopoly, we have a responsibility to regulate it, and if needs be, in some cases, as history have shown, to break it. That's the reason why the ICT has been liberalized to the point that it is, to some extent, and even though we have liberalized it, we still doesn't have full market because it's really dominated by two players, similar to what we have here, primarily two players. So I think anyone can agree that both monopolies or duopolies need to be regulated in the best interest of the consumers, because the market that of where supply is concerned, the freedom or the principles that supplies need to basically meet in that middle ground isn't there. And that's the reason why your office exists. And it goes back to my original question. It's not a matter of using the nuclear option. It's a matter that, one, as you said, those companies are buying from a subsidiary company. In other words, the bill of lading that you see is what is generated from their own company. Now, in terms of the financial statements, since you do regulate the fuel companies, have you seen their financial statements? Do you get to see their financial statements?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we haven't, but we currently are in possession of their financial statements.
Okay, and those financial statements would pretty much still show what it is that they would have, their own intercompany transactions that they would have with their own subsidiary, that in the grand scheme of everything else would basically wash on consolidation. So from us, when SEMA regulates an entity, like even these banks, and these banks are in multi-jurisdiction, where there is that connection, they go up to even the parent level to find out what is happening there too, if needs be, because ultimately any risk that the parent has would also naturally fall in subsidiary. So in that situation, how far back up the chain do you guys or your office go to look at these entities to see exactly how risk is managed? Because what I can say to you right now, and looking at the prices and going us by CUC's annual report, there is no way, with the government having done its job of taking just as much about everything off the price of diesel, that in some years, the price that CUC is putting through or paying for fuel is even greater than the retail market in the US. And we're talking about buying at the wholesale level. Something must be fundamentally wrong when a company like CUC that uses, I think, about 3 million gallons or whatever a month or something like that, which anybody would assume would be a major purchaser when you spend over 30-something million gallons of diesel a year. When you cannot get a price that is, and this is even after converting, just so you know, from US gallon to imperial gallon, I did a 1.201 conversion rate too. When CUC's price is more than what a consumer on the street is pulling up at a pump and getting and even factor in for the difference that the government charges for duty and even factor in for fuel, something must be fundamentally wrong with that model. Can we at least agree on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, where I'm struggling, sir, is it the accumulated expense you're referring to for fuels for CUC as opposed to the
Okay.
other segments?
No,
or?
no, I'm going to break it down. I want to start with CUC, because where my point is this. CUC is buying 30-something million gallons of fuel. Tom, that pulls up his pickup truck in the United States at any of those gas stations, is able to get his fuel cheaper than CUC. And even after doing all the conversion, and even after I factor in the government duty and the cost of transportation, Tom is still able to get a cheaper price for his fuel. Bear in mind now, the fuel that you see in the United States also include the federal tax that's built into it and other taxes that's built into it, so it means that those guys are getting it even cheaper. And even if you go further north, in New York and in places, that is even a little bit more expensive. When you start looking in those regions, the fact that CUC is reporting in their annual report some years, fuel that costs more than the average consumer can pull up with a pickup truck and get it at a cheaper rate than CUC after doing all the conversion and adding for those stuff. Something must be wrong with that model. There's no way CUC as a wholesaler should be paying more than even a retailer is getting in the States, and even after factoring, like I said, the government duty and even additional costs. Now, I went through a painstaking exercise to go back and pull 10 years information to do this, and I can send it to you if needs be too, to show it. But something is fundamentally wrong with that model. And the question in all of that is recognizing then that CUC, and I've said it before, the efficiently run company, except for the fuel part of it, is paying more for fuel than a retailer in the States with their buying power. Something needs to be done about that, especially where the fuel is a pass-through straight to the consumer. Now, the issue that I do have, and this goes back to the subsidiaries that are basically producing the invoices that you see. We need to go back further. Now, like I said, market is the market, and I think they use Platts Gulf Coast is what the prices that CUC uses. And it was difficult to find those Platts information, but I got it too. Okay? The issue is, looking back at it, those invoices that are produced by their subsidiary is a problem because we still don't see what it is that they're getting for it. And when you do look at some of the markups that they're making compared to, like I said, the wholesale market in the States and the retail market in the States, it is very uncompetitive. And the question in all of that, what I want to get to is, what advice has your office given to Cabinet as required by law to make that situation either go away or better? Because at the end of the day, you guys are the experts, you are the technocrats, you are there to give that advice to the policymakers so they can act the policy. Trust me, I would love to beat the government on this, but at the end of the day, guess what? Your department have that responsibility to give that policy advice to Cabinet, to the policymakers. And the question that I start with, what policy advice have your office given to Cabinet for them to do something about that situation that I just outlined to you?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. The advice we have given government so far was a number of outlined high-level cases that we can consider once we've completed the preparatory work, to intervene into the markets. I am not at liberty to share those publicly, but these are very high-level options, but we also outlined very clearly to government that these measures can only be implemented once we have the description you outlined of a market done in a formal way, because we are going to expose ourselves if we jump head into this sort of arrangement without setting up the structure and the framework for the regulation of the market. We have also outlined on a number of occasions that using the U.S. as a benchmark or as a reference point is treading in dangerous waters, because it is always going to create the argument that we are being disadvantaged, that the market here is inefficient. The U.S. market does not, and it really cannot, in fairness to all of us here and the public, we really should not be using the U.S. as a benchmark. We can look at trends in the U.S. to understand movements, but when we look at the U.S. as a benchmark in terms of quantums and movements, margins and volumes, it's a very, very fundamentally different arrangement.
Hold on, sorry.
Just a minute. What is your benchmark you're currently using?
Currently, through you, Mr. Chair, sorry. Currently, we look across the region to see where prices are and price trends are. But more importantly, we are focusing as the regulator.
No, my question was, what is your benchmark? You can't tell me across the whole. What are you doing? Taking the whole region and taking an average, or what is your benchmark? What is your benchmark today on what fuel prices should be in Cayman, specifically?
Through you, thank you, Mr. Chair. We reference prices in Cayman based on price that the importers use to purchase and add the various layers and determine from there where prices ought to be as our reference point.
There is no benchmark.
Mr. Chair, yes, there is a benchmark.
What is the benchmark? $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $15 a gallon?
To establish a price point for the Cayman Islands, we need to determine what a reasonable, there are certain givens in terms of the taxes and the logistics costs that are incurred to bring fuel to the Cayman Islands, and the margins and markups by the refuelers, by the importers and the retailers to establish a price point. Once we have that number, we look at comparative jurisdictions such as the Bahamas, Barbados, Bermuda, St. Lucia to see where prices are, to understand if our prices are an outlier or if our prices are reasonable. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Through you, Mr. Chair. When we had SEMA in here, I asked their insurance person who was in that seat a question. And before I get on to my questions, I want to ask yourself a question, sir. Who do you work for?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I work for the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, the statutory authority of the Cayman Islands government.
Correct. For the people of the Cayman Islands. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I sat and made some notes, and I started to think back. In 2002, I took over an establishment called Express Lube that was owned by Texaco. When it started to make money, I asked for a gas pump. They said no, because Texaco and Esso were not allowed to retail, and that business was owned by Texaco. Through you, Mr. Chair, my apologies. When did the law change that Rubis and Sol can now own gas stations and retail?
Just to correct you, the law hasn't changed.
But I want him.
Oh, okay, all right.
When did the law change that Rubis and Sol can now retail and own gas stations?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I am not aware of the change that was made to the law to allow for the Rubis and Sol, I assume the wholesalers, to own and retail fuel in the Cayman Islands.
Correct. I couldn't find where it had changed either. But you do know that Rubis and Sol own gas stations now.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, we are aware.
So in other words now, Mr. Chairman, we're seeing it now. So the supplier is wholesaling it, then they're retailing it, and they're competing against the local people who has gas stations. Am I correct again, sir?
Through you, Mr. Chair, their ownership of retail site is via a lease-back arrangement. In that way, they own it and they lease it out to the retailers, and the retailers have some level of independence. The retailers have to purchase their fuel from the wholesalers and then market it back, competing, as you outlined, among the independent and the various forms of ownership arrangement and at the retail level. Yeah.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, through you. Dominance equals significant market power. I want to get it straight today because this fuel thing is a sore point across the country. The little man, and just in case to be perfect, the little man and the little woman is feeling this more than any of the big people at the top. And all of the fancy talk, all of the going around the bush that I've seen with this off-reg can't. Dominance in economics is the ability to set prices or other conditions independent of the market demand. And this is exactly the problem with Rubis and Sol. It is the job, am I correct, of off-reg to regulate this.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the job of OFREG is to regulate that arrangement that you refer to.
Okay, and you all did research, from what I found, on the distributors, on the gas stations. Rather than looking hard is what is effectively, I'll use the word that the member from Bodtown West used just now, duopoly, on the wholesale distribution of fuel. Why did OFREG decide to do a market study of the retail side? Because they don't necessarily set the price. It's Sol and Rubis. Why was there not a study done on them?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to clarify, the current market study we're doing is across the entire fuel sector, so it includes both the wholesale and retail. I go further to say, in order for us to have a full grasp, and as you asked earlier, to effectively regulate, we must understand what is happening across the entire supply chain in the Cayman Islands. And to the earlier question asked by your colleague, we do have the power, if we see that there are elements that we need to go further back up the chain. We do have, as to the extent the law allows, to investigate those arrangements, understand its impact. And if you look at the design of the current market study, it includes all of that, looking at corporate structures and how it impacts prices and their operation in the Cayman Islands.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Saunders, he wants to come back, Mr. Chairman.
So just to expand on the area that my colleague from West Bay North went into a while ago, using Rubis as an example. Rubis buys from a Rubis subsidiary. The Rubis subsidiary sells to Rubis here as a wholesaler. And then the same Rubis organization actually now owns retail organizations. So they're buying as a super wholesaler these parcels. They're selling it as a wholesaler here. And then their wholesalers are selling to themselves as a retailer. And somehow we expect that the market forces of supply and demand to work in that situation where literally every step along the way, it is pretty much the same organization one way or the other. Now, earlier, and I just came off Ruby's website, and you were saying that you look at the region, and I just clicked on the Fuel IQ. That's a good thing about the internet. I looked at Puerto Rico, which, as of today, in prices in the US, is $2.96 for UK gallon on the global prices for retail. Sorry. And in the Cayman Islands, it's $5.14, a difference of $2.18, the share of almost double. Puerto Rico is in the same region. Jamaica is in the same region. Bahamas is in the same region. And all three of those all have prices that are cheaper than the Cayman Islands within the same region, even if you don't want us to use the US. The same ships going from port to port, dropping their fuel off. And someone would want us to believe that the 75 cents that the government makes on retail fuel or the 25 cents it makes on diesel for CUC is supposed to, once we take that off, that's going to be the magical solution. So the people of this Cayman Islands via the government must make nothing on fuel, and these guys make every single thing on fuel. Mr. Monroe, I'm going to tell you right now, OFREG may have been around for 3 years plus, but the Fuels Inspectorate has been around much longer. And this is a problem that has gone on for too long. And it can't be more than 3+ years to do a report, to send the cabinet, to send to the policymakers, to say this is what needs to be done. Because they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting something different. And we're now finding ourselves in that. And as I said to the chairman yesterday, it doesn't matter what research or what analysis or anything that is done. The only thing that's going to matter to the consumers that we all serve, the people that came as we all serve, is cheaper fuel at the pump and at the plug, better internet speed, and at a lower price. Right now, we are not getting value for money. The law, as it is written, was there for the protection of consumers. And even within the very law itself, there is also a consumer protection. And even that part of the law is still not even been implemented yet or followed through yet by the OFREG. And if it can't be done in 3.5 years, my question to you is then, when can we expect that decision or that paper to go to cabinet and to even come to the Legislative Assembly so we can make the decision if laws need to be changed to do what is best for the consumers? That is my question in all of that. When can we expect to get that information?
Through you, Mr. Chair. We are finalizing the paper, the study, so I would say within 2 months we should be wrapping up that exercise, which I explained earlier was faced with some setbacks due to the COVID. So we will be concluding that current market assessment to make our recommendation to government on the way forward. I would also like to take the opportunity to clarify 2 quick points. In terms of the Fuels Inspectorate, I can confirm that you're correct. The Fuels Inspectorate, formerly known as the Petroleum Inspectorate, has been in existence since 2003. But the mandate of the Petroleum Inspectorate then was purely on safety and compliance. We have taken on the role or the function of assisting with gathering prices and looking at these trends, but it was not part of the Fuels Inspectorate in its former state. So the fuels regulation, the economic regulation of the fuel sector only came into being with OFREG, and from the first day of OFREG, we set about getting the process moving to get the framework in place to have the regulation of the sector, effective regulation of the sector. We've had some setbacks, which we outline. I would also want to caution on the use of the website that Rubis has hyperlinked, because I think that's linked to a website called Global Prices. Those prices are not up to date. We have been looking at it also, and it's not reliable. The prices currently reflected for Cayman is likely pre-April or May of this year. So it does have some issues with it. So I would just want to caution on the use of that, so that we have at least a better assessment as to where prices are in the region. Thank you.
Here, through you. When have you all addressed, or do you intend to address, the SMP of Sol and Rubis?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the Honorable MLA. The market assessment is intended to address the SMP of these two entities as part of our, I can call it, universal approach to regulation of the market. It is difficult and it may not be effective. We've looked at the parameters to just address those in isolation. While the rest of the market is freewheeling, it's not going to necessarily achieve the purpose of effective regulation. So addressing the SM, the significant market powers referred to for Rubis and Sol, is part of the current assessment we are undertaking.
Mr. Chairman, through you, just if we could back up a little bit, but I think we will end up where we are right now, because I certainly also enjoy the questions that are being raised by my colleagues. Off-reg's remit is to regulate utilities and encourage competition within the market in the Cayman Islands. Would you accept that as accurate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness. We talked briefly earlier about what you defined as the nuclear option, and I think certainly it's not just your definition, but I think it's safe to say that it's been the definition of both the current government and previous administrations, that price control is a nuclear option, the last resort. Off-reg's viewpoint in fulfilling its primary function is that an alternative to price control would be to encourage competition. Is that accurate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct. Off-reg's primary and principal position is to drive more effective prices in the market through enhanced competition. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman. And when we look at that competition, particularly at the wholesale level, there really are, and correct me if I'm wrong, only three players, Rubis and Sol as the primary suppliers, wholesalers, distributors, and the most recent entrant into the market, Refuel. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Is it correct to state that unlike all of the other retail arms of filling stations who buy their product from one of these three wholesalers, only one of these wholesalers owns a gas station and buys direct from the market? Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So the arrangement is of the three majors as we define it for this discussion, because the third entrant is indeed a formidable player in the market. That third independent player is purely independent, so they source their products directly from overseas, whereas the other retailers participating in the market, as you correctly outlined, would purchase from either Rubis or Sol.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, through you to the witness, would you agree that as Executive Director for the fuel sectors, your broad remit as stipulated by certainly this government, the entire Legislative Assembly, as recently as the most recent Finance Committee, where there were rather significant, serious calls to defund off-reg and just simply start again, clear the board. Would you accept that your remit as Executive Director of Fuels is to ensure that the fuel market and the fuel sector in the Cayman Islands remains efficient and competitive, which by extension translates into whether the prices being charged by wholesalers or retailers is fair and equitable? Would you agree that that is your primary broad remit as Executive Director for Fuels?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that would be a significant element of my remit, because we also need to ensure sustainability of supply and fuel quality, all bundled together to ensure that the customer's experience, the service and the product that the customer expects is of an acceptable quality and standard.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, through you to the witness, when did you take up your position as Executive Director of the fuel sector?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I took up that role when OFREG was formed on the 16th of January 2017.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness, can you tell this committee what forward progress the fuel sector has made in ensuring that fuel prices, both at the wholesaler and retailer level, have been considered fair and equitable since taking office? What forward progress have you made in fulfilling what you have acknowledged is your primary remit as Executive Director?
Through you, Mr. Chair, some of the things we have looked at as a team under my direction in that capacity is to ensure we're collecting prices on a regular basis. We monitor retail prices. We receive all information that is stipulated under the Dangerous Substances Law, Section 10, by the importer, and we trend that information to ensure that any change in price is consistent with the first cost. It's moving in sync with their cost of acquisition. So where costs increase, they are allowed that increase. Where costs decrease, they are required to reduce their prices accordingly. In carrying out that function, there are occasions when we would have gone to the wholesalers mainly to indicate that the price that they are charging or the acquisition of product is now reflected in the price that they are selling to their retailers, and that they are required to bring it back in line. There are cases where they have complied. There are cases where they made otherwise justification. The most significant was during the onset of the COVID crisis and the lockdown that was in place in the Cayman Islands. We were not, that was the most, as I would say, the most significant, not blatant case where we observed that the reductions were not passed on. Hence, we initiated a detailed probe, because they were claiming that there are costs that we weren't aware of that they would have incurred. We see all of the costs, to make that clear. We get all of their information. So in those instances, they said to us that there are costs that they would have incurred that we were not aware of, hence the reason for some delays in movements. So we went to them to get all of that information. Thank you.
Sir, I know,
Just
Mr.
one quick
Chairman, I know you
question.
just want to ask a question, but just on what he just stated. So you identified in your assessment that prices being charged were not equitable and fair. You raised this with the supplier, and their response to you was there were hidden cost charges which you as the regulator were not aware of. Did they provide you, as the regulator, details on what those hidden cost elements were, and therefore what was your reaction. Do you agree that those costs are legitimate and therefore reflective of the prices being charged? Or do you still have, as you did in the beginning, questions regarding the price in which they are charging as not being fair and equitable?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would refer to it as unanticipated costs. They label it that these are costs that just arose during the period for various reasons, and we have not gotten that. We've gotten some of it. We're working on just various bits of it as we outlined before. So we are getting those costs. We need to see them so that we can make a determination as to whether it's acceptable for us to accept them, for it to be passed on or otherwise. Thank you.
You, in the answer to the member from Prospect, you said that they are required to reduce their price. What authority do you have to require them to reduce the price?
Mr. Chair, the provision of the law sets out that we monitor the very same Section 2 of the fuel market regulation, require us to ensure that prices locally are in accordance with global price. Now, that's an area that is a bit misunderstood because, as the MLA from MLA Saunders said, that that point slipped me. But the law sets out that we have to monitor those prices based on global prices, which is the acquisition cost. So their prices are required to move in line with those prices based on that provision in the law.
Are you planning to order a rebate when you finish this study? Because I find it interesting that you call it a study and not an investigation, which I would think would be more appropriate to a regulatory body other than a study. But are you planning to demand a rebate for the consumers if you determine that the price was not lowered fast enough?
Mr. Chair, so you are correct in the reference. What we are doing now, based on what we observed in the last 3 months, it is an investigation. The market study is the larger, wider exercise that we are undertaking that went through the full RFP process. So when we would have concluded on that investigation, there are provisions under Section 45 or 46 of the URC law that we can require of Rubis and Salt to take in order to pass on any reasonable reduction that should have been passed on to the public.
Sorry, just so I'm clear, and I'm glad my colleague from Prospect raised this. Is it our understanding then that a recent decision taken by Rubis to make that immediate drop in prices that was advertised, I think 30 cents or something drop, that was a result of your office basically pushing them to do that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, the recent 30 cents drop in the most recent price reduction you're referring to, that's what was part of our initiative to say to them that the prices are not fair. So they may have reacted, but we did not actually require them to say, reduce it. We have said to them, we are very concerned that you have not passed on the level of reduction that's required, and we need information. In the process of providing us this information that was unanticipated, they took the decision to actually reduce the price at the pump.
Okay, just so I'm clear now, it means then, recognizing now that we are told that when fuel comes in here is a 2-3 month lag, is it then for us to understand that that batch that came in, when was the date that fuel arrived on island? And then the question is, that batch then, it means that those quote-unquote unanticipated costs that came in with that batch, where else or who else was affected within that batch that came in, where those prices should have also actually been dropped?
Through you, Mr. Chair, you mean where else in terms of other jurisdiction or other customer segments?
I'm interested in Cayman because normally we're told that when the fuel is on island and we're seeing fuel at the pump, those are fuel that's coming from storage. So it means then that that fuel would have been on island maybe 2-3 months or whenever it would have arrived. So basically in essence, the rebate that took place is probably on fuel that arrived 2-3 months earlier. So it wouldn't have been fuel that would have arrived yesterday. So if there's a 2-3 month lag from storage to the pump, it means then that for at least a month, if not more, that fuel should have been 30 cents cheaper per gallon based on what it is that you have just said.
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
So then the next question, to go back to what the chairman and the member Northside was getting at, it means that for a minimum of a month, at least, if not more, it means then the fuel should have been 30 cents cheaper to the consumers, even though they dropped it after. So the question in all of that then is what happens to the rebate, or where's the penalty, where's the punishment, because the consumers overpaid at least for a month based on what you have just revealed here. So the question is, what is the recourse then to the public who got, like myself and my constituents and the many others who actually, quote unquote, paid a much higher price? I don't want to use the term ripped off, who paid a much higher price during that time. What is the recourse for them?
You, Mr. Chair. So the exercise that we're conducting is to determine exactly what you're speaking to. The extent and the quantity of fuel that would have been sold through the retail network that should have attracted a certain price that did not. So we will then determine that this is the amount that needs to be passed on. And there are so many ways that we can do that. Not to let too much out given it's in the public, but that can mean that the prices that we currently are seeing should be held, even if they see increases for the foreseeable future. So the mechanism has to be the one that is most effective for us to implement, rather than some form of refund, which is going to be difficult to do. So it is just going to be a case where the public will see maybe a prolonged period of reduced pricing than one would normally expect, because they've acquired product at a higher price. So if also what you're getting to in terms of Duke Monroe paying for this fuel, overpaid for this fuel, do I get a rebate? That would be a very difficult mechanism. So it's just a case where the general public, in terms of the prices that are at the pump, will probably just have to be held at that level, even though they're seeing increases for a longer period of time, and not me personally getting back my...
Mr. Chairman, I have tons more questions for this witness, but I do understand we have other witness. Is it okay if the committee recalls him?
What I'm going to suggest is that because we have another witness has already been waiting 20 minutes on this, and obviously this is not going to stop here. I would like to ask, is the committee available for not this Friday, the following Friday? Yeah. Mr. Monroe, can I ask you to make yourself available to be recalled next week, Friday? That will be the 24th of July, from 9 until we finish.
Mr. Chair, I am fully available.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry to interrupt the line of questioning. Mr. Austin, did you have a pressing one you wanted to continue, or?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Just to sort of ring fence, if you will, the questions that have been asked already this morning. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. No, sir. Through you, Mr. Chairman, we have talked about the various fuel prices layers that are experienced in the supply chain before it gets either in my car or is used to create the energy in which it takes to power my lights and my AC, etc., through the utility companies. I want to walk through what is available to anyone, a cursory overview as to what some of those layers may be, and in financial terms they would be considered margins and markups from the time it comes out of the ground in Texas or wherever until it comes into the pumps in my car. Fuel or petroleum products, Mr. Chairman, through you, first comes from the refinery or overseas bulk terminals. That is a fixed price that is outside of the Cayman Islands' control. It is set by the global suppliers. The first point where that fuel witnesses an increase is at the supply or trading price, which in the Cayman Islands context would be fuel when it is first acquired out of, for example, Port Everglades, Florida. The supplier who has gained that fuel from the refinery adds a markup. So there's your first margin. That fuel is then shipped to the Cayman Islands. There are fixed costs associated with that petroleum product, and they come in the form of government duties, port charges, pilotage. There's the throughput for the pipeline. These are fixed costs, but it adds another increase on that original refined price. Then there's the rack price, or the terminal price, which we accept is charged by the two primary wholesalers and distributors, Rubis and Sol. It's a distribution cost. That adds another layer on that original price. So a third markup. And finally, when that fuel or petroleum product reaches the retail pumps and goes to the retail consumer market, there is a fourth markup. So from the time that fuel comes out of the ground until the time it goes into our vehicles or used to power our lights, that price has witnessed a margin increase 4 times. Would you agree?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's generally correct.
Thank you. What I want to address is, in terms of OFREG, whose primary responsibility is to regulate and encourage competition, OFREG has an opportunity to regulate not at the refinery level, but certainly at the supply point, again at the distribution point, and again at the retail point. So of those areas, there's, I think, 1, 2, 3, of those 4 stages, OFREG has authority in 3 of those 4 margin increase stages. Would you accept that as being accurate?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would like to correct that only 2 points we have jurisdiction over, at the retail and at the wholesale point. We can look at supply arrangements, as MLA Saunders pointed out, in terms of their subsidiary, but our core jurisdiction is onshore, and that would be at the wholesale and at the retail levels.
Thank you. My final point, my final question, and it was around the primary suppliers of Rubis and Sol as the traditional suppliers of petroleum-based products in this country. Refuel is a third player, but we'll leave them out of the context of this conversation right now. You stated that it is a fact that that supplier owns more than one stage in the supply chain. I think, put in corporate terms, Rubis and Sol would be defined as a vertically integrated company owning 2 or more stages in the supply chain of the product in which they supply. Would you agree?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Then would you also agree that as supplier, distributor, and retailer, that the main suppliers of petroleum products in this country have the ability, you can tell me whether or not the evidence suggests that there is actual proof of this, but they have the ability to artificially inflate the prices that would otherwise set market price in this jurisdiction, simply from their 2 or more stages in the otherwise supply chain, and reminding folks that they are the supplier of this product in the first place. Do you agree that as their vertically integrated model suggests, and being two of the three primary, if not exclusive, suppliers of petroleum products to the Cayman Islands, that these two suppliers have the ability, through their vertical integration, to artificially inflate prices and thereby determine overall market price in the Cayman Islands?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, they do have that ability to artificially inflate prices. However, we have the ability to, in fact, check those prices, verify those prices against globally benchmark prices, because they are not operating in a vacuum, and they are not, even though they own two stages in the supply chain, they don't own at the refinery level, so they have very little influence, very little ability to influence refinery price. So when they go to the refinery, they pay prices that we can verify through the same platform that MLA Saunders referred, Platts, so we can ensure that the starting point of their price is in line with a verifiable price that is globally available.
One quick question, Mr. Monroe, before you go. Where is Rubis Caribbean headquarters located?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Rubis headquarters in the Caribbean is located in Barbados.
And where is Sol headquarters for the Caribbean located?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we are still to get some further clarity, but at this point, their operational headquarters is in Barbados, but their corporate headquarters for the Sol Caribbean region is right here in the Cayman Islands. We're not fully clear as to how the lines are drawn in terms of the operational element in Barbados and the corporate element here. So we'll get some
Actually, I can tell you, you know what Sol stands for? All right, you know what Sol stands for?
Yes, sir.
And you know where that family comes from?
Yes, sir.
All right, to be continued next week. Thank you.
Just one quickly. Are you all, through you, Mr. Chairman, are you all still responsible for safety inspections with the fuel and those things?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that is correct.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ronald, we're going to excuse you now because we have another witness waiting, and we expect to see you 9 a.m. Friday the 24th of July. And I have one request. Can you please bring copies of the LCCLs under which Sol and Rubis operate for this committee when you come on Friday? Thank you.
Noted, Mr. Chair. Thank you. May I clarify whether that is something that should be requested through DCI, or is it something?
Are you telling me you don't have copies of those in your office?
I will need to verify, but the LCCL is actually issued through.
I'm not questioning whether who is responsible for issuing it. I'm asking you to bring us copies of the LCCL, and I certainly would hope that you would have that document in your office.
Noted, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Because if you don't bring it, I already got it. The committee will be suspended for a few minutes. We're trying to find out where Mr. Ali Famoy is, who was the witness that was scheduled for 11. And we have gone over a little bit, but we would expect him to be. He's here. Oh, okay, well, let's get the committee back. Come. Bring him in so I can swear him in.
Ready? I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give to this honorable legislative assembly shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Ali, for coming, and let me first of all apologize for having you wait for an extended period of time, because the discussion with the fuel side of off-reg was obviously going to take some time, so we've had to recall him as a witness next week to continue rather than make you wait in vain. So we thank you for the opportunity to come here, and we thank you for the for waiting. You know the routine. You've been here a couple of times. The first time you answer a question, you give your full name and title. That's for purposes of the record. You know that we're dealing with the Office of the Auditor General's report on the efficiency and effectiveness of the Utility Regulation and Competition Office, and you're here as the Director of the Telecom sector. And you want to lead off this? Okay. Would you agree that the performance of off-reg, including your sector, in terms of the expectations of the public and what the public was told would happen once we created this off-reg in the process of debating the law and passing the law, that the expectations of the public for improved internet, improved telephone, greater accessibility, cheaper prices has not been achieved?
Mr. Chair, Ali Fa'amoy, Executive Director, ICT. In short, yes.
Are you getting sufficient support from this body that has been created above you? Because prior to that, you were the I don't remember the exact title, Director of ICTA, and you had a board to which you reported, and you were managing the ICTA environment. Has the creation of this extra level of bureaucracy enhanced your ability to manage the ICTA, or has it slowed things down, for want of a better word?
It's held us back.
Do you believe that is a result of inactivity at the board level, or we were given the chairman said that the biggest problem, one of the bigger problems they have had as a board, and he as chairman, was response from cabinet in getting things. And the example he used was that the amendment to the off-reg law that was done in 18 has not yet been commenced. Has these kind of things hampered your ability to improve the quality of and price up to the public?
Yes, we've had difficulties. The chairman is right. We've had difficulties getting papers presented or improved and considered by cabinet. But to give you an example of your first question, when I was the managing director of the ICTA, my board would meet for 5 hours or so and would focus on ICT matters. This board has asked us to keep our regulatory presentations and discussions to 15 minutes.
Pardon? And what is the rationale of that board? Because you sit on the board, so you would have been aware of that decision. I would think that a presentation from a sector under which that board governed to be limited to 15 minutes is the operative word is limited, because that's limiting everything.
I don't know the rationale. It doesn't make sense to me that a regulatory board would handicap itself in such a way.
Yeah. Okay. Can you give us, because the picture that we got yesterday on how the board functions is that the board is very efficient and very effective, and the fact that the sector directors sit on the board enhances if I remember the phraseology used was, they don't know how to go and look for you because you're there, right? But you're suggesting that if you have you have done a research paper, for instance. Let's take a good. Let's see if I can find an example. Let's say the Maya cable that comes in, and you have spent 2 or 3 months doing the necessary research in the international environment, what's going on, and whether you want to make a recommendation that we should have another cable or that we replace that one. That presentation is limited to 15 minutes?
We've been asked to keep our presentations brief, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I was so curious. How long does your board meeting normally last?
7 hours.
7 hours. And if there are 4 sectors that your board look at, which is 50 minutes apiece, that's 60 minutes, one hour. What do you guys do for the other 6 hours? Honestly, you don't know what now, you know. And we have seen the minutes too, just so you know.
The board, as you know, has struggled, as OFREG has struggled with any number of issues, and those struggles continue.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, what kind of struggles,
Yes.
if you don't mind me asking, what kind of
Specifically,
struggles?
what are those struggles?
The board has been asking for an HR manual for quite some time. It's been, I think, a few years now. The board has asked for any number of other policy manuals and continues to chase them.
For HR manual from who? Don't you have a CEO who should be responsible for driving an HR manual for the collective off-reg? Who you requested an HR manual from?
The Chief Operating Officer.
Off-reg. And he's still in post?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay. Well, you know, and this will come as no surprise to you, but when can my constituents expect to get better internet? We've had schools were closed because of COVID-19.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt the chairman because I'm still processing this 15-minute 7-hour board meeting. One of the questions we asked the chairman yesterday, and this is just my personal view, an error does not become a mistake until you fail to correct it. And we saw from the Auditor General report that the synergies and everything else that should have been realized from OFREG 3+ years in has not been realized. Now, as I said, and I think I can safe to speak for this committee and maybe the entire Legislative Assembly, that I think all 90 members will agree that these sectors need to be regulated. So there's no ifs, ands, and buts whether or not they should be regulated. But then, we do expect them to be regulated in an effective and efficient manner. And one of the questions I did ask the chairman, which I would put to you, sir, is did we prematurely brought organizations together under one synergy, or is it a situation where the incubation period of each, whether it be the ERA, the ICTA, and et cetera, the other two, should have, I guess, matured a little bit more before they basically merged together? Because one of the things, and the reason I'm asking this question, and I really feel bad, I look at Mr. Monroe, and not to pick on anyone who was hired before in terms of doing the fuels inspectorate, looking at the quality, safety, those kind of issues, to then move that position into that of a regulator, it is almost a night and day requirement. And it is those gaps, those, as we go through those like skills gap assessments and everything else, those, or the SWOT analysis that the chairman referred to yesterday, as we start going through that scenario, is it a situation where maybe we should have left it the way it was and allow those entities to mature a little bit more? Because each of those entities are their own challenge and their own struggles on their own. And then to bring everybody under one umbrella, one roof, before many of those individual teething problems were sorted. No, we have basically taken all the individual problems, all the individual struggles, and put them together in a bigger pot, hoping that we would have fixed the two synergies or whatever. The question and all of that to you, Mr. Famo, is would we have been better off at this point, or is it safe for us to accept at this point that the idea of what we wanted OFREG to be versus the reality of what OFREG is and what OFREG is on a path to become, in your opinion, do you think the mandate or the successes that the public expects from OFREG in this current environment, this current setting, with these laws and these players, because the players also, do you think that within the next year or two, OFREG can meet its mandate to the public of getting better prices at the fuel and the pump and better internet speeds and basically at a better price? Do you think that is possible at this current trajectory that you're on right now?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you can have your question.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just get back to the delays that the witness expressed are existing at the board level, which are hampering his ability to complete the broadband expansion of the fiber optic network into the eastern districts and onto the sister islands. You said that the board struggles with a great many things. One of them is getting an HR manual. Can you outline to this committee the importance of this HR manual and its otherwise impact on, again, your remit to expand the fiber optic network? Surely you have a contract that outlines what your primary obligations and roles are to OFREG. You are the director. I suspect you set the pace for all of the subordinates under you in your department. So how is the delay on that HR manual somehow hampering your ability to fulfill the government mandated policy of expanding the fiber optic network into the eastern districts and onto the sister islands?
Mr. Chairman, I gave that as just an example of the types of things that, that the board has been working on, and which takes up a lot of the board's time. I offer no excuses for any of our failures other than to say that the requisite resources that I need to get my job done, I don't have. As managing director of ICTA, I had a well-experienced, seasoned regulatory lawyer. When he left us to become and return to the UK, and he's now the general counsel for the UK's oil and gas regulator, and we love him to death, but I'll never forgive him for leaving me. We struggled to find a replacement. These are not skill sets that you can easily find, and not just in Cayman. These are skill sets that are difficult to find anywhere. So we had to contract for regulatory lawyer expertise and also for economic expertise. The board instructed us to exit those contracts, and we still do not have a regulatory lawyer.
Who are you contracted with, sorry?
Mr. Richardson, who was our former GC, continued to do work for us on a part-time basis while he was in the UK. And we also contracted another firm out of Canada that was basically a regulatory lawyer that had worked for Cable & Wireless for many years across the Caribbean and had actually lived here in Cayman. So he knew the market and he knew the telecom space very well. So those two provided us with a lot of assistance to move things forward.
Mr. Chairman,
Who do you use now? Sorry, who do you use now?
We don't have a regulatory lawyer.
Mr. Chairman, I want to get back to that point. I'm assuming, and maybe the witness can correct me through you, the Auditor General in their report, the efficiency and effectiveness of OFREG, talked about value for money and specifically the use of consultants, which I'm assuming this attorney would otherwise be defined as a consultant to the ICT division. Paragraphs 95 to 105, found on pages 38 to 43. 10 pages of the, I think the 30-odd page OFREG report was spent on value for money and use specifically of consultants. Paragraphs 95 to 105, to refresh your memories and certainly to summarize, states that OFREG spent over $1.7 million on consultants between 2017 and 2019 and did not receive value for money from this. The majority of spending on consultants was in 2017, $1.05 million, which accounted for 23% of the total annual expenditure. Annual spending on consultants was reduced significantly to a total to $217,000 in 2019. OFREG spent $850,000 on 5 consultants over 3 years, mostly in the ICT sector, found on Exhibit 12, which is found on page 39. The Office of the Auditor General's audits of OFREG's 2017 and 2018 financial statements identified a number of weaknesses in its use of consultants, including the absence of a tendering process. Presumably, OFREG just goes out and handpicks which consultant they think is most qualified for the job based on their vast experience and assigns it to a consultant, which, of course, defies the various processes and protocols which go about achieving value for money, the primary purpose upon which this committee meets in which to discuss and to ensure that the taxpayer monies are being spent with good value. Paragraph 102, found on page 41, reports that the non-executive directors on the board started a review of OFREG's contracts with consultants in September 2017 and concluded, again, that the contracts did not achieve good value for money. So I put it to the witness, Mr. Chairman, through you, that when the member blames the lack of appropriate resources being made available to him and his division for the reason why we have not progressed in the expansion of fiber optic networks past east of Prospect, and that includes your constituency, Mr. Chairman, and the members from Bordentown West, and the members certainly from the Sister Islands in this post-COVID era, where certainly we've all met via Zoom or otherwise, and communications has been absolutely key when we consider the number of students, particularly those that pass the Eastern Districts, who have been educated through online learning and have complained about poor broadband services, the inability to, connect with their teachers, the inability to fundamentally do the work in an online world. I put it to the member, to the witness, certainly for an opportunity to respond. The government simply was not willing to write any more blank checks, which in 10 full pages of a 30-some page report, Ofreg, if you would consider it an Achilles heel, the single largest Achilles heel for Ofreg is that it hires consultants, ignores the standard process in which to go about hiring those consultants, pays them what the Office of the Auditor General believes to be not value for money. And yet at the end of the day, we still have no forward progress on the expansion of fiber optics in the Eastern Districts and Sister Islands. And we are told that it's because you haven't been given any assistance and resources. I put it to the witness that you've been given carte blanche with consultants and assistants and resources, and $1.7 million in taxpayer funds has been spent, for which did little to show for it. How should the government provide you with the resources that you so badly need, whilst also understanding that we are all beholden servants to protecting the taxpayer public purse?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to congratulate the OAG for a comprehensive report. I think her staff, the Auditor General and her staff have been nothing but consummate professionals throughout this entire process. Mr. Chairman, you may not like what your doctor tells you when you go in for your annual checkup, but you expect him to be professional and to be truthful. We may not like the diagnosis that Dr. Winspear has provided us, but to ignore it would be folly. To the member's point, the resources that we were deploying at the time that we were using these consultants, contractors, legal contractors, while there may definitely have been ways to engage them more appropriately, absolutely, and we take that on in terms of how we conduct our affairs. Those were not necessarily exactly related and directly linked to whether or not fiber reaches the Eastern Districts. The committee is also aware that we do not build fiber optic networks. What we do is regulate those who do. And the regulatory remit that we have is to make sure that they have a license obligation to meet those obligations. Part of our role as a regulator is to monitor for enforcement. Part of what we have been doing is making sure that the telcos abide by their rollout obligations. In order for them to do that, they need access to infrastructure that they don't own. They need the ability to trench onto roads when it's necessary. They need the ability to access buried ducts that may already exist. They need the access to poles to attach their lines to poles. The providers who control ducts and poles have been difficult, to say the least, to work with. In our space, as a regulator, there is something called information asymmetry. A regulator is always smaller in size, in scope, and in resources than the entities they regulate. This is a common thing. In 2019, the budget for the FCC in the US was $333 million. The revenue for a one of the smallest mobile providers for 2019, Sprint, was $33 billion. They are 100 times larger than a regulator, and they are a small provider. This information asymmetry exists in just about every country around the world, and it exists here. In our attempt to make sure that our licensees got access to polls, we challenged just one of 6 areas that Datalink was imposing on telcos, and that is something called a reservation fee. Datalink took us to court through judicial review and spent 3 times what we spent on lawyers, and we lost. Now, you can argue that maybe the judge was right and we should have done things slightly differently, but I will say to you, regardless, every single time we go to battle, we are going to be outnumbered and outgunned. Despite the fact that we were paying for regulatory legal assistance, we were still outnumbered and outgunned.
Who owns Datalink? Sorry, who owns Datalink? I'm not familiar with that company.
Datalink is a wholly owned subsidiary of CUC that manages the communication space on all of the poles that CUC has.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Chairman, through you, just moments ago with the previous witness, I introduced a term called vertical integration. And we were referring to it, and certainly in the context of, obviously, our fuel and petroleum product suppliers, who, again, admittedly have the ability, as the witness stated, to artificially inflate and set market price. Now we have an energy provider who operates in this country under a license agreement, who happens to also own the transmission and distribution network upon which these products are otherwise made available. And it too is owned through vertical integration by the energy provider. Now, I appreciate the challenges that the member has, but certainly these are areas for regulation. Is the utility provider in this instance, in their vertical integrated corporate structure, operating arguably outside of their license agreement, as perhaps may be the question in the fuel sector, is my question through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness.
If the member is asking if the power company is operating outside of their license, the answer would be not, as far as I know. The reason why Datalink was created was so that CUC under its license with the ERA at the time could not operate businesses that were not to do with power generation. So they could not do what they wanted to do, which was create this communications service. So they were required to set up a separate subsidiary and get that subsidiary licensed by what was at the time a completely separate agency, the ICTA. So while CUC had their license with ERA, they set up this separate entity and got it licensed by the ICTA to do the communications piece on the poles, and that is Datalink.
Just a curious observation, Mr. Chairman. The utility provider, Caribbean Utilities Company, owns the transmission and distribution network, i.e. the poles which extend power and telephone service across the Cayman Islands. One of the problems with monopolies, but it is what it is. Yet, if I'm not correct, if I'm not mistaken, Hurricane Ivan came around, tore up a whole bunch of poles, which the taxpayer of this country refunded to put these poles in the ground so that that transmission and distribution network may continue uninterrupted. The people of the Cayman Islands paid for those poles twice. We paid for them when they were first installed, and therefore, through incremental markups through our bill, the CUC bill that we get isn't just for the cost of generating electricity, but there's a percentage formula for infrastructure upkeep and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 15% return. So we paid for it when the poles were first installed, and then after Hurricane Ivan, we paid for it again to have those poles put back into the ground. And now a subsidiary company owned by the utilities provider, Datalink, who is dependent at selecting what space on that pole, companies like Flow, like Logic, like C3, can otherwise connect themselves so that they can fulfill the government mandate, which is contained in the telecoms license agreement, to expand the telecoms into the eastern districts and onto the sister islands. But yet we are restricted, the public, the consumer, is restricted from the benefit derived from that growth, because the utility company who owns the transmission and distribution lines, who has had those poles paid for by the taxpayer, restricts who and when can have access to those poles. And fundamentally, the bottleneck, instead of looking at C3, instead of looking at Logic, instead of looking at Digicel and Flow in terms of why haven't you built out the broadband network to the eastern districts and sister islands, the question largely has to be, why haven't you, CUC, the owner of the transmission and distribution network, or why have you made it so increasingly difficult for telcos to do as their license requires? So instead of, I mean, is that a correct assertion of the facts that obtain behind why we have not had any success whatsoever in building out the telecommunication fiber optic network past Prospect?
Mr. Chairman, the short answer is yes.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to state for the record, I just like what my colleague from Prospect just went to. And yeah, I just had to make a note. That was a very good observation that he made. Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Mr. Famo, considering then that fiber optic is available, and it appears then that the regulatory body, OFREG, try to get this, because I think, sorry, just to go back a little bit, at the beginning of liberalization, one of the things was that what the ICTA was doing back then was to encourage co-location, so we didn't have multiple poles all over the place, multiple towers all over the place, to allow people to share. So that was one of the things that was pretty much embedded within OFREG. And I know in some cases, Cable and Wireless had used Digicel towers, Digicel used Cable and Wireless towers, and even think Westel back then are one of those, or even AT&T. So co-location is a common thing that the regulator gets into from an infrastructure cost. So taking that thread a little bit further, it appears then that there is a fiber optic cable around the country. Expanding on what my colleague from Prospect just said, that is a situation now where the regulator, your office, try to get that infrastructure shared with the other telcos for a reasonable cost. And is we to understand then that that area data link, which is owned by CUC, had a problem sharing that infrastructure with other telcos who basically wanted to get fiber throughout the country. Is that the situation that happened? So you took them to court, and they spent 3 times as much as you, and you lost. Well, they took OFREG to court, and they spent 3 times as much as you lost. Is that pretty much what happened?
Generally, yes. The telcos, some of the telcos, not all, have an agreement to attach and have a space reserved. But the costs and the time to do what's called make ready, in other words, go to a pole and adjust that pole so that it can accommodate attachments. The costs are just astronomical, and our licensees have complained about the costs. They have complained about the time frame. They have complained about the process. We have a dispute before us right now that tries to address some of these issues, and we suspect more disputes are coming. My problem is I don't have a regulatory lawyer, so I don't know how we're going to be able to dispose of these disputes.
Question. Just one very quick question. Sorry, Mr. Saunders.
Well, you and I we have had our own battles when I was at Digicel and you were at Cable and Wireless, Lime, Flow, whatever. It's just a situation, because I remember the culture back then in both Cable and Wireless and Digicel, that every single letter or query from the regulators is answered back by lawyers. Is that the culture that still exists to this day?
Pretty much.
So in other words, then you have to keep going on, because we used to spend a lot of money on, in fact, we had an old division back then that dealt with legal and regulatory to deal specifically with you guys. So in other words, we're basically saying at this point that OFREG is on the staff and on the resource, and I don't expect you guys to have the deep pockets that Cable and Wireless and even Digicel in bankruptcy will still have. Is that the situation now where everything is lawyer, lawyer, lawyer as you go to them?
Yeah.
But we have our own experiences, because that's a different story for a different time. But my question then that I'm trying to get from this then is, if these companies are still uncooperative, that we now have children at home that is struggling because internet speeds are low. We have people working from home because internet speeds are slow, everything is basically slow. Are we to understand then that there's an infrastructure around the island that can actually be put to good use, but because of disputes between multi-million / companies, and in some cases multi-billion-dollar companies, because of these disputes, are we to basically understand then that a network is sitting there, there's dark fiber around this country that is basically unused, that could be put to public use and basically enhance the quality of people's lives?
Whether it's dark fiber or simply infrastructure such as ducts to be able to enable a telco to put their own fiber in, they would all prefer to use their own fiber because of the control and the technology issues around it. Every one of the telcos is ready, willing, and able to deploy. They even want to deploy in the sister islands. But the incumbent operators, CUC and Flow, are problematic.
Well, okay, let's be devil's advocate for a minute, because if I was CUC, I mean, does CUC have future plans for these fiber? Bearing in mind that the fiber can take a lot of traffic. What is the excuse being given for not wanting other people to use? Because you see it in the US right now, where literally everybody's sharing network. I mean, so much so I think even interconnect agreements in the States are pretty much gone. I mean, even the billing for interconnect is almost gone. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what reason then, considering the bandwidth that these fibers have, what is it that data link / CUC or anyone wants to do that is preventing someone else can even get in a little using infrastructure?
To be clear, and to give them, to be fair to CUC, the fiber infrastructure that CUC has was built as a way of them communicating with their remote parts of their T&D network and providing data back to their control centers. What the telcos are telling us is that that type of fiber that has been deployed is not the type of fiber they need for high-speed broadband connectivity. It's a difference between monomode and multimode type of fiber and the type of laser you can use, and therefore the type of speeds you can get. So basically what we've been told is that the telcos would use it if they could, but it's not the kind of fiber that they need, and it doesn't have the architecture that they need to be able to. Basically, they have a sort of star and hub and spoke model where they deliver out to a cabinet on a piece of fiber, and then that cabinet then either uses fiber or copper to deliver to the homes. So that type of architecture wouldn't be easily accommodated, is our understanding, by trying to use what CUC has, which is a single type of ring infrastructure. So to be fair to CUC, they do have infrastructure, they have made it available, it's just that it is not compatible with the way the broadband providers build and deploy their networks. That's why the Data Link offers pole attachments for the telcos to attach their own fiber to the poles.
So the dispute is really access to the poles.
There are multiple
Yeah, but
areas of contention with regards to attaching to poles, yes. There are also multiple areas of contention with regards to access to buried ducts, which is with flow. We have several disputes before us right now that we would like to resolve.
So what I'm trying to understand then, I'm sure there's good commercial reasons why CUC would have made their decision, but ultimately, as a regulator who pretty much regulates competition, is there a situation that you guys made a decision and Data Link challenged that decision? Is that what happened?
If you're referring to the judicial review?
Yeah.
Yes, so there were multiple areas of contention that we brought the industry together as a working group, and what came out of that were multiple problems, multiple areas of contention. We made a determination on one, the concept of a reservation fee. Our issue basically was, you can't charge me a reservation for a hotel room, and then when I show up, you say, oh, hang on a minute, let me go build the hotel room first. Is basically taking money for something you don't have. We made a determination on that it was not proper for them to charge reservation fees for a space that did not exist. That termination was challenged by judicial review. And the result of the judicial review wasn't about the decision itself, it was about a technicality with the process of how the determination was issued.
Mr. Chairman, on that point, space that did not exist. I'm trying to understand this. So we have a CUC pole. I don't know how tall they are. 65 feet.
What about you?
You have lines attached to the upper portion. The usable space upon which telcos may attach themselves to, is it above the existing lines or below the existing lines?
When you typically look at a pole, the power lines are at the very top, as you pointed out. What you'll typically see is a black cable at the very bottom, which is typically your cable and wireless cable that's been there for decades. The communication space is basically from that point 3 feet up, 36 inches. And sometimes that communication space doesn't exist, not safely, because the pole is too short, or there's a transformer in the way, or something like that. So the process to make ready the pole, which is a common term that's used in the industry across the US and Canada, is to basically either replace that pole with a taller pole or make other adjustments to the pole to create that communication space if it doesn't exist, or to make it safe for the telcos to attach to that pole. There might be a power line that's too low, or a connection to another pole that isn't right. So basically cleaning it up to make that communication space available and safe.
So when I think of what happens next, we've already talked about poles that the taxpayer has bought and paid for. We've already talked about the fact that the taxpayer has fundamentally paid for those poles twice by the energy company because they own the transmission and distribution network. Is the expectation from the utility companies, in your opinion, that the taxpayer comes along and again pays for this retrofit of 36 inches so that other fiber optic networks can be attached to it? Or is the expectation that, like Flow, the other telecoms need to not go above ground in their fiber optic build-out, but they need to invest in the infrastructure necessary to take their fiber optic connections below ground, and thereby saying to, whilst Flow has the infrastructure the question of why they haven't built out into the Eastern Districts and the Sister Islands is really a question that you can best answer why they haven't done it. Maybe that's the problematic nature. But then we have the new entrance of Logic and C3. The alternative is if the existing T&D network won't allow you the opportunity to expand your services, then it is incumbent on you, should you wish or should there be a requirement in your business license to provide it, to make the infrastructure investment that would otherwise carry that fiber network to the Eastern Districts and the Sister Islands. And presumably, if you can't go above ground because that space is occupied, then underground fiber optic cables is the only alternative. Is that the correct assumption? Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the witness.
There were several questions there, Mr. Chairman. One is no, we don't expect the taxpayer to pay again for any of these. The standard practice is that the attaching utility, the phone company, for example, would pay the make-ready. In other jurisdictions, what happens then is as future telcos come along to attach as well, they then basically reimburse the original telco who had to fork out all of the money to the power company to make the changes. They get some sort of reimbursement for another telco making the attachment. So there's no free ride for anyone.
And the new telcos on the market, the Logics, the C3s and whatnot, they're comfortable with paying that make-ready fee, or are they hoping to just simply get attached to the pole for free?
They understand there is a cost associated with performing make-ready. They just want it to be fair. If I can summarize some of their concerns. To your other questions regarding other options for infrastructure, the duct network extends in Grand Cayman pretty much everywhere on the main roads. It extends past the East End Exchange in East End. When I was working on the roads with the aid of machetes and much coconut water, it went all the way up almost to what was Queens Highway. It didn't extend that far at the time, but it also went all the way down to Kemenkai Exchange. I was part of the team that actually brought Kemenkai Exchange online. So the duct network is extensive. We just need to be able to make sure that the telcos have what they are entitled to. Under Infrastructure Sharing Regulations 2003, if you have ICT infrastructure, you are required to share it, and that includes ducts and poles. To your other point, there is a third option, and that is for someone to put up a comms-only pole. If CUC is going to charge you $2,500 or whatever it is to make a pole ready, you might be able to plant a pole for a lot less, especially if it's only a short one for comms only. We've discussed this with the industry. We've told them we would be willing to work with the NRA to work on the setbacks and so forth to make these things happen. All we can do is, I think this committee has discussed what Ofreg's mandate is, and it applies to ICT, and that is to encourage, foster, and promote competition. We can't tell them what to do or how to run their businesses, but we can make sure that the regulatory framework is there to support options.
So just thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for the witness and his testimony. And certainly, just so I can make sure that we are appointing blame and responsibility where it rightly belongs. Ofreg has been a beating stick since this administration began by all members of this Legislative Assembly, not just those on the government bench, but certainly those on the opposition bench, and arguably the consumers themselves. But when we think about the reality that perhaps we thought would never happen, caused by COVID, the country was shut down because of a flu, but then we realized the importance of telecommunications, that it is a requirement that the child in East End studying by lamplight, online learning, deserves just as much opportunity to learn as the child doing that same studying in Georgetown, West Bay, or Bordentown, well, Georgetown or West Bay. But because of the infrastructure owners, CUC, who owns the pools, Flow, who owns the underground ducting that runs through the entirety of the island, their inability, unwillingness, otherwise unable to agree on a fair market price to share this infrastructure. They're the ones, when we're looking for someone to blame as to where the bottlenecks exist in this process. Not OFREG, and in particular to the witness, the ICT division at all, but it is the owners of this existing infrastructure, frankly, being unwilling, for one reason or the other, to share those resources. That is why the entire eastern side of the Cayman, Grand Cayman, and the sister islands must arguably be stuck with 60s and 70s era internet service, which is equivalent to dial-up, when the rest of the country is in broadband, in some cases, certainly financial services, terabyte land, wonderful speeds. Is that where responsibility and, for lack of a better word, blame in this context rightly belongs?
Mr. Chairman, I am under oath, and as easy as it would be for me to say yes, member, you are correct, I cannot. In part, yes, but we have our share of blame to take with this. We need to be more aggressive and more forceful in the enforcement of the regulations that exist. And there is a third area as well. There is no part of this country that doesn't have access to broadband. The problem is that the promise that was given to us when we liberalized this marketplace and Cable and Wireless surrendered their monopoly license voluntarily was that consumers would have choice. We have competition. We have 4 telcos. I have an application for a third mobile provider that we're working through right now, so there's no lack of competition. The problem is choice. There is no one in the sister islands other than one telco. And there is no one in your district, Mr. Chairman, that can provide you with broadband but one. Therefore, although again it would be easy to agree wholeheartedly with the member in his statement in terms of allocating blame, there is yet another area that needs to be addressed, and that is quality of service. You should get what you pay for, regardless of who you get your service from.
I just want to, through you, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the witness for his
But
honesty, his straightforward honesty, because I think it's very refreshing.
I just want to give you a scenario which conforms exactly what you just said that I have just gone through. As I started out earlier, when the schools were shut down and he did that, I went to the trouble. I had Flow. They have fiber optic at certain houses in north side of my district have fiber optic, you know. And when I'm getting to the point now where I want to question the economic and social relationship and the choice that these companies are making and who they're providing fiber to. I went to the trouble to invite the competitor, Digicel, to put another Wi-Fi station in my house so my children would have greater access, or they would have the other one, and I would use that one in my office for my research and stuff, right? And here's what happened. They told me, oh yeah, we got a new system, it's wireless, we'll bring it, put it on your desk, you can get between 30 and 40 megabytes, no problem. Oh, okay. Called me up on the phone, agreed. The guy showed up at my house. I had to call him 3 times before they actually sent somebody out to do this work. They showed up with a little black box, which was exactly, except for color, to the white one that I had thrown out of my house 3 years ago. So, okay, bored a hole in the wall. The antenna that they used to use before is still there. We went up on the antenna, installed this thing, right? Come inside, and the guy is there for 4 to 5 minutes struggling, right? And I am not a technician, but I know there should be 3 little lights, right? And he's only getting half of one light. So I said, well, you seem to be having a problem getting this installed. Yeah, he said, Mr. Miller, we're having a problem. This thing is going and coming. I said, but I don't think that's what I was supposed to get. I think I was supposed to get something that is a different thing that sits on my desk, and I'm supposed to get up to this thing. He said, yeah, but I can call them and see if they'll let you have that one. And he continues to struggle, and he can't get this thing to work. So he said, well, you know, the real problem here, sir, is the antenna. Now understand that my house is less than 500 feet from the antenna, right? And there ain't no houses or no trees that are above where he has the thing. This is direct line of sight to this antenna, right? So I said, what's the problem? He said, well, you know, we know that this antenna has a problem, sir. We've been having interference here. We can't figure it out. But I want to tell you that the antenna's on the island, and as soon as we get that up, this thing will work perfectly. Right? So I said, well, you know, you need to carry that back with you. So he wants me, I'm not signing anything. Right? I didn't sign for it. It's still in my house. It still doesn't work. It is so bad that I could not complete a Zoom call, right? When I tried to hook up to it with my friends, with 3 people on the line, right? And they haven't come back. Now, I'm probably going to make the presentation to the CEO for Digicel when he comes here next week of that criteria. But the question I'm asking you, in your monitoring of quality, have you been made available, that been informed that this tower in Old Man Bay has some interference, and everybody on that end of the island is suffering because this thing has been going on, according to the guy who was doing the station for me, for months? It's so much that they could order a new tower, have it on the island, but he don't know when it's going to be installed.
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to that specific location, but I am aware that both Digicel and Flow have been experiencing some interference issues, and they have come together to propose to the office that we reassign some frequencies. Basically, they're stepping on each other's toes in the radio space, and they have come up with a solution where frequencies can be reallocated to reduce or eliminate this interference. And we're actively working on that to get it done, which will hopefully improve everyone's experience island-wide. The other issue.
The greatest of respect, for the last 5 years, you've been telling me the same thing here in these hollow chambers, that the companies agreed we got to solve the problem, they can solve it. In the meantime, all the people on my end, unless you're at a certain economic bracket and you have a house that's probably worth more than a couple of $1 million, you can't get fiber.
What we're working on that is more than just a soon come, sir, are consumer protection regulations. My team is working on a cabinet paper to present the final CPR for ICT to the cabinet. If I wasn't here right now, I'd be working on that right now. We hope to have those published for the benefit of the consumer this month. What that does is set the precedent for us as an office being able to proactively measure quality of service experience and hold the service providers accountable so that the consumer, we just don't believe it's rocket science that a consumer should not expect to get what they pay for. It's a very simple concept.
Mr. Chairman?
I just want to finish up on it. But here's a problem I have, and I am not technical. I grew up with lamplight now, so I know electricity, right? But the technician that comes to my house, and I'm paying for 10, and I measure it and I'm only getting 6, right? Tells me that what I really need to do is pay for 25, and I'll get better service. I says, well, how are you if you can't give me 10, how are you going to give me 25? Literally, the man says to me, I can just turn the screw up. I said, well, do me a favor now. Turn the screw up now so I can get the 10 I'm paying for. But it doesn't happen. And the rationale is that when you're that far out, if you get an 80%, I think was the numbers we've used in the past, you should be grateful. Well, if I only get 80% of what the thing, if I'm paying for 10, then give me 15 so I can get my 10.
Mr. Chairman, we operate based on the concept that where the market fails, the regulator must act. We've heard that particular story too many times. The consumer protection regs and new license conditions will fix that.
Mr. Chairman, just going back to the witness response to your question, prior to OFREG, the ICT, Information Communication Technology Authority, operated under its own remit. The witness gave evidence which suggested that under this latest construct of OFREG, his ability to forward plans for whether it be broadening of the broadband network or other advancements and outcomes have been hampered by his testimony as a result, first, of having to report through a board. We're talking about now the OFREG board, chaired by the Honorable Linford Pearson, who we had witness testimony from yesterday. And then those delays, as was given witness testimony, were laid at the feet of the now Chief Operating Officer for failing to provide things like an HR manual or model, which the witness in his testimony suggested was just one example. My question to the witness, according to the Office of the Auditor General report on the effectiveness and efficiency of OFREG, it stated from cover to cover that there was a lack of merger planning, that is, moving away from the way things were previously done to amalgamating them under one umbrella of OFREG. Their governance model is unique across the entire jurisdiction with the makeup of their executive leadership, and as such, it blurs their otherwise operational model, who's in charge of who's subordinate to who answers to who, what are the reporting lines, etc. As we have seen in the various value for money assessments, value for money fundamentally is non-existent at OFREG. There is no risk assessment model. They've only recently adopted a code of ethics standard, and there's been no measurement of performance. Now, whilst it may be convenient to lay all of that at the feet of the Chief Operating Officer, I wonder, through you, Mr. Chairman, if the witness would answer. The Chief Operating Officer only took his post in the fourth quarter, or the latter part of 2018. Surely all of these gaps that existed prior to his arrival, certainly since the 16th of January 2017, would have fallen on the shoulders of the responsibility of the Chief Executive Officer, of which OFREG has had, whilst only 2 substantial post holders in the post of CEO, they have had 5 in grand total CEOs since January 2017, if we include the interim CEOs, of which included the witness, the President Executive Director for ICT, as the interim CEO. My question to the witness is that the same obligations that he is now laying at the feet of the Chief Operating Officer, who only took his post in the latter portion of 2018, surely all of these missing elements would otherwise be considered the responsibility of the Chief Operating Officer to ensure are implemented. So, whilst I cannot ask you to speak for other Chief Operating Officers when they had the opportunity to hold the post, but let me ask the witness, why then did you, when you held the reins as interim chief executive officer, not sought to fill these gaps, whether they be an HR model, whether they be a merger planning model, whether they be a governance model, whether they be a merger model, whether there be a risk assessment model? Why didn't you implement them as CEO?
Fair question, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'm not laying any blame anywhere. I was asked what is occupying, examples of what occupies the board's time. I gave an example of a particular document. There was a further question about who's responsible for that document. So those are just the facts. The ICTA had an employee handbook. When OFREG was constructed in January 2017, there were drafts to change the document. I actually was involved with the first CEO to hire HR experts to help us draft those and bring them into line with the new laws. So the drafts were available when the change happened with the change of CEO. A decision was made to start afresh, and that takes time. Plus, a lot of laws changed in the interim, such as the Public Authorities Law, which changed quite a bit in terms of practice, and the Data Protection Law as well. So, for whatever reason, decisions were made to change course and abandon what documents had been done before. I wasn't involved in those. I'm not sure why. In terms of my tenure as acting, when the board refused to appoint the chairman as CEO in August 2018, after J.P. Morgan's departure, I removed my name from consideration. So we were left in a position where we had no leader. The other two executives were candidates for the role, and were asked if they would be willing to act. They agreed, and I actually suggested to the board that they be appointed in rotation, so that they could gain the experience, and they could also provide the board, who were also doing the recruitment, with an assessment of performance. That continued from August until February 2019. And at that point, I was approached by the chairman and deputy chairman who said that they had made a selection for the new CEO, and it was someone else who was currently, at that time, a regulator in Turks and Caicos. And they expressed some concern because the annual plan and the annual budget were not done. And we were therefore in violation of the law. So they asked me to act until the new CEO took post, and to prioritize creation of the annual plan and the annual budget, which I did. And I acted, so I was not part of the rotation. I simply came in to clean things up and prepare the way for the new CEO to arrive, which happened 7 months later.
Just one final
That's
question,
true.
Mr. Chairman.
One
Just one final question.
Did you apply for the CEO job?
No.
Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I think from the witness testimony outlining certainly the challenges that have been experienced since the 16th of January 2017 to date, it is clear to say, and it's not necessarily considered a leap, when I say that as far as the off-reg model is concerned, whether it be governance or operational, there is still a long way to go, and a great deal of work yet to be done in order to properly equip off-reg to do the job that it has been asked to do. And I think also it is safe to say that if we accept that there is still a long way to go and a lot of work yet to be done, that we can also expect that work filling those necessary gaps, whether they be providing just the ICT sector with an attorney, for example, and resources, that these resources and the need to fill these gaps are going to cost money, whether it be hiring people, placing the physical infrastructure in place, or, of course, the salaries attached to the persons who will be charged with their respective duties and responsibilities. So the public should expect to pay more for off-reg rather than less, despite the spending that has occurred in the last 3 years that has caused some, particularly those in this House, to just say, get rid of it, it's costing too much, it's not working, let's come up with a better plan. If we acknowledge all of that to be true, and I asked the witness whether he acknowledges that to be true or false, if he will accept those statements. But if his answer is yes, then we go to the off-reg, the report of the Auditor General, and the basis upon which we are here today. The Office of the Auditor General made 16 recommendations to off-reg. Is it our understanding, at least from your perspective, that all 16 of those recommendations are valid and should therefore be acted upon at the earliest possible timeline? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
To address the statements the member made, Mr. Chairman, the ICT sector is fully self-funded and has been from time it was ICTA. In fact, the ICT sector remits to core government $6 or $7 million a year from what we collect from our industry. And as Managing Director ICTA, I maintained a 6-month operating reserve from the funds that we collected from license fees, et cetera, to make sure that if there was a pandemic, a hurricane, and revenues into the regulator were interrupted, that we could continue to operate and pay salaries, et cetera. So to the member's assertion that the people of the Cayman Islands would need to pay more in order for us to get our jobs done, not for the ICT side of things. I know there's funding issues elsewhere in off-reg, but the ICT sector is well funded enough to carry on its functions that it needs done. In terms of the recommendations from the Auditor General, we welcome all of the recommendations, and I personally believe all of them are reasonable and can and should be executed ASAP.
Mr. Chairman, I have a ton of questions, because one of the things I still having a hard time wrapping my head around is that since liberalization from March 2004, if I was to go back and look at the net profit of the telecom sector versus the net profit of CUC, they have made far more net profit, both Cable and Wireless and Digicel combined, for the lease, not including other players, than CUC. And with that said, understanding that situation and that relationship, because while Digicel may have some excuse with regards to why they can't offer some services, because they can argue that they came expecting certain co-location, certain services, and certain regulatory environment. Cable and Wireless, or Flow, really has no excuse as to some of the services that they're providing, having had a head start and so having a head start for so long. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, if it's okay with the committee, because I realize we're way off track, and the next witness is due probably the next 40 minutes or so, is that, Ken, similar as though we're bringing back Mr. Monroe next week, would the committee just look at also bringing back Mr. Famo next week, Friday also, so at least I can get into and I'd be curious also, based on the information given here today, and once the providers do come in next week, Wednesday and Thursday, to at least have a better chance again to also go back, because some of the concerns I do have, we need both sides of the story to some extent, and then we can look at it going forward. But my question is going to be quite long and lengthy, and it's definitely going to be out of time, and I don't want to open up a track that we won't be able to finish today. That is okay with the committee. Thank you.
Mr. Ali, would you be available for next week, Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock?
I've asked my boss if I can take every Friday off for the rest of the year because I have a ton of vacation piled up that I have not been able to take. So apparently I'm free next Friday, yes.
Well, we certainly appreciate you giving up a vacation. But you can fish until 12, you know, right? And next Friday, depending on where the moon should be, the early morning bite will probably be the best bite, right? And that's okay with the committee, right? Okay, so what we would do then is terminate your as a witness now and invite you back next week, Friday, not next Friday the 24th, which is, next week Friday at 1 o'clock. I too have a lot of questions that we have to get to, so I guess it's safe to say that we totally underestimated the time we would need. But that was just me and my efficiency mode trying to fit things in. So, but thank you very much for your time today, and we certainly appreciate you giving up your vacation time to come talk to us next week. Thank you very much. The committee is suspended until 1:30.
There was plenty of time to get in a renewal application. So if you don't renew your permit within the period that is allowed, then you have to apply for a new permit in the usual way.
Yes, and for those who have no employment and their permit have expired, what would you recommend?
Sorry, I missed the first bit of it. Those who have?
Those who do not have any employment and their permits have expired. In other words, they'll be seeking time. What do you recommend at this point?
Well, I'm sure that work will work with them until it is possible for them to either get new employment or find